showing that we would expect RPKs to fall an average of 38% this year, and passenger revenues to be $250 billion lower. These are figures for the year as a whole. Within that annual average 38% decline for RPKs is this profile. And as you can see, during the second quarter of this year, and that is obviously April to June, we would expect to see industry level RPKs, air travel, more than 70% lower than it was at this time last year. So this is the intense pressure quarter for the airlines, and this analysis focuses on this particular quarter. Before we get there, you'll see that by the end of the year we're not expecting the industry to be back where it was. The economic forecasts are suggesting at the moment that we're already in a deep economic recession in this month and the second quarter. The expectation is that the very substantial fiscal and central bank stimulus packages will produce a strong economic upturn at some point, but not before the fourth quarter at the earliest, and probably in 2021. The issue for the airline industry is that they might not be able to last that long. And if we look at these numbers, which we released also recently, at the beginning of the year, the median airline had around about 2 months of cash in its bank, in its balance sheets to last. So that's the critical issue. So it's important, and our focus now is how quickly are airlines burning through those cash balances. I think the first point to note is that obviously with much of the airlines fleet grounded, there are costs associated with flying that will obviously be much, much lower. So things like fuel or airport charges are going to be down very substantially. You can see here that capacity we expect to be down 65% in the second quarter. And also, for the fuel that is used, it's a lot cheaper. Although airlines around the world have hedging practices which differ, we think the net impact on the fuel price will be about 30% cheaper. But that's going to produce a significant fall in the variable costs, the cost associated with flying. The challenge is that that represents perhaps 50%, a little bit more, of the typical airline's costs. The green part of the pie chart shows those flight associated costs, fuel, user charges, passenger services, that will be clearly cut very substantially by the grounding of the fleet. The trouble is that airlines also have costs that are either fixed or semi-fixed, and that probably goes for crew as well. So, it's difficult to avoid to cut all of these costs, although, as you know, airlines are doing their best to take out as much cost as possible. But there will be a limit. There will be some unavoidable costs that airlines have to pay, even if their fleet is grounded. And that's really part of the cash burn, the cash flow challenge. And then there's one final element, apart from the unavoidable costs, and that is that airlines have accumulated quite a large amount of tickets that have been sold but not flown. Flights have been cancelled. We estimate that in the second quarter of this year, there's around $35 billion of tickets that are due for refunds. So that would be, on top of the unavoidable costs, another very big drain on airlines' cash flow. And you can see from that red bar at the end, that's our estimate of what the cash burn, the reduction in cash balances, will be in the second quarter as a result of those unavoidable costs and the liabilities, the potential for $35 billion of tax tickets being refunded. So a total of $61 billion in the second quarter. And the final slide really just gives a little detail of those calculations. So you'll see from the top, revenue we expect to be down 68% for the year in the second quarter. Obviously, there's nothing airlines can do about fixed costs; they're unchanged. Those that are sort of semi-fixed, MRO, station expenses, and the like overheads, as well as crew costs, we're expecting those to be cut by a third across the industry. Variable costs, fuel, etc., down 70%. So we expect airlines to do what they can to take costs out of the business, but that still leaves costs there to be paid. The net effect of that on net profits in the second quarter, as you can see, is a loss of $39 billion. The equivalent this time last year was a profit of about $7 billion in the quarter. So, big profit loss. But that's not the total of the challenge, because if you look down, we add back depreciation because it's a non-cash cost, but the big hit in addition to those unavoidable costs is the unflown ticket liability. It's a change in working capital of $35 billion, which leads to the $61 billion reduction in cash balances. So a burn rate of cash in the second quarter of 61 billion. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Now I'd like to call on Alexandre to provide just a few comments to put that into context, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone from Switzerland. As you know, the situation of the airline industry remains severe. We published last week, the revenue loss, which we will count at $250 billion in 2020. And Brian has worked through the impact of that scenario on the bottom line. So you have heard the figures, $39 billion net loss for the second quarter. And we also see the industry burning $61 billion in cash also in this in the second quarter. So it's something, these numbers show that this crisis is beyond what we have ever had in our industry. It's also a reason why we have called for action for government for action, and they have showed a pretty open attitude. We have seen a lot of announcements related to financial rescue packages. Just to mention a few, $2 trillion in the U.S., including more than $50 billion for airlines. Packages announced in Colombia, Singapore, Australia, China, Norway, New Zealand, also in Europe. So the governments are putting big amounts of money to rescue the economy and particularly the airline industry. As also Brian mentioned, we are facing $35 billion liability for tickets sold but which are unflown. That is not because we have cancelled our flights for our interest, but it's a direct result of the restrictions imposed by governments on travel, on flights, on and the measures that have been taken to close borders. So it's an immense amount of money to refund in a situation in which, as you have understood, airlines are quickly running out of cash. So we have proposed vouchers to passengers in place of refunds. Some governments have authorized this methodology to refund Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Netherlands, to preserve the cash of the airlines. We are totally conscious of the inconvenience it might represent for the passengers, but it's for us a matter of survival, as we have this big, enormous cash problem in front of us. Just a last word on cargo. The one part of the industry that continues to operate is the cargo sector, and it's even struggling to meet demand. So because passenger operations have been reduced, and the consequence is to dramatically reduce cargo capacity below the passengers. So we see a lot of freighters coming back into service, full freighters, and airlines are also very creative, transforming passenger aircraft into cargo operating aircraft. I mentioned that because maintaining the cargo traffic and even encouraging the cargo traffic, facilitating the cargo traffic is a key issue, not only for the economy, to maintain the supply chains, but also for the fight against the coronavirus, because we transport medical equipment and drugs and materials, and also some specialists and medical personnel everywhere in the world where it is the most needed. So, as a conclusion, you have seen that vast parts of the industry remain shut down. It has been a very difficult week. We should have some additional difficult weeks in front of us. The light we see is the open attitude and the actions taken by governments to help the economy and to put together rescue packages for companies and for airlines that could help us to cope with this incredible and unprecedented crisis. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions with Brian.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandre. The first question we have is asking if we have an estimate of loss or revenue for the first quarter.
Brian, you want to take the...
Shall I take that? The first quarter was relative. I mean, obviously, towards the end of the quarter, we started to see the pressures, but we don't have an estimate at this stage. But we certainly started off the year actually relatively strongly in January. It was in February we started to see markets collapse, and no doubt losses building.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Next question is from Brazil. It says that we understand that there are difficult times for the airlines, but also in Brazil, the ground handling companies are saying that they might have to interrupt their work because the airlines aren't able to pay their bills. Do we see this as a risk, and what is IATA doing globally to avoid that the partners in the industry break down?
It's of course a risk to see one element of the value chain of the industrial process collapsing. So whether it's ground handlers or on the other side of the value chain, travel agents, it's a problem for the whole industry. So what we are doing is in our communication relations and lobbying efforts that we are deploying all over the world towards government, we explain that that governments must help airlines, but also the whole travel industry and the whole aerospace industry, because everybody is suffering, and so the rescue packages that are put together by government should also benefit to the other parts of our industry, including ground handlers, but also travel agents, or OEMs, or aerospace manufacturers. So it is something that should be helpful for all the elements of the value chain in our industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandre. We have a couple of questions about bankruptcy. One is, do we have an estimate as to how many airlines could go out of business in the second quarter? And then how will that impact connectivity in the long term, as those airlines that do survive will lose their alliance and co-chair partners?
We don't have what we said, and if we remember Brian's presentation, he last week, I speak under your control, Brian, but you were saying that half of the airlines could run out of cash in the coming 2 to 3 months. So, but on the other hand, we have good news, quote unquote, that are the first of all the significant reduction in the oil price, but in addition to that, the rescue packages that have been put together by governments that should help significantly the airlines, especially through cash injections by all means, and help them to bridge the gap. So it's a bit difficult at this stage to give you a proportion, a number, an estimate of the potential bankruptcies in the second quarter, because the effect of all these packages and these relief measures is not easy to quantify or to appreciate now. But perhaps, Brian, you want to say something complementary?
Yes, I agree with what Alexandre said. In fact, one of the things that we've seen in the industry is there's been a relatively small number of financially successful airlines, and we've seen a lot of airlines out in the capital markets raising debt and equity as well. But there's a long tail of airlines that are much weaker. So there's clearly a substantial risk of bankruptcy. As Alexandre said, the extent to which that happens depends on the rescue packages. And in terms of the future connectivity, I think that's something that we're calling on governments to recognise that it is essential that the industry as a whole, so not just the airlines but the air transport industry as a whole, is preserved to the extent that during the recovery period we can still connect cities and get the trade and investment flowing again. That's going to be essential for the recovery.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. We have a question about the potential impact of airline bankruptcies. First part of the question is, will that lead to a bigger market for second-hand airplanes? And secondly, will the potential exit of some players from the market result in lower costs for the remaining airlines?
It is clear that for the market of second-hand aircraft, if we see bankruptcy, you will have a lot of aircraft on the market. On the other hand, I can tell you that I know nobody that is ready in the coming 6 to 9 months to buy any aircraft or to have new aircraft or even second-hand new bought aircraft entering into service. There is no issue in buying any aircraft in any airlines now. So you will have perhaps more aircraft on the second-hand market, but nobody will buy it until the end of the year at best. At best, from my point of view. The other part of the question was, Tony?
What would that do to cost if you had some people exiting or some players exiting the industry?
For the moment, it is clear that the costs are driven down. Is not only the fuel costs, but all the costs, because the airlines are putting an enormous pressure on costs for obvious reasons. If there is a consolidation in the future, it could lead to an increase in cost, but it's too early to predict. And the effect of the crisis are so huge on the economics on both sides of the P&L that we wouldn't forecast any increase in cost and any increase in ticket prices. On the contrary, more pressure on cost, more pressure on ticket prices probably. But that's a prediction.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question about cargo and wondering whether the current level of activity in the cargo business could mean that what was a weak part of the industry going into this crisis could actually emerge much stronger in the post-crisis world.
In the cargo, being stronger in the cargo, the point is the following: every airline, many airlines, not all, but many airlines, they have a cargo sector in which they operate either full freighters or through the belly of the passenger aircraft. Airlines have now been used for years and years and years to see this part of the activity fluctuating with ups and downs. So we have currently an up because there is a strong demand and not enough capacity. How long it will last, we don't know. But I do not see that evolution as a key transformer of the industry. It will not transform the industry significantly. You will still have a cargo sector in the airline business, plus some specialized cargo operators that are doing better these days. In the future, it's another story. And may I remind you of the fact that we, in the past 12 months, even 14 months, the cargo sector was in a pretty difficult shape. If you remember, volume and prices were declining. So I wouldn't expect a significant transformation triggered by the current crisis in the cargo sector or between the cargo sector and the passenger activities.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is about passenger demand. When do we expect it to hit bottom? And at what point would we start to see it returning to 2019 levels?
Shall I take that one, Alexander?
Yes, please.
I think in past pandemics we've seen this V shape to the travel profile with a sharp recovery, after about 6 months. I think this time is different, mainly because we've got a deep recession. The lockdowns have stopped the world economy to a large extent. There are going to be job losses. There's going to be clearly a fall in confidence. I think that will certainly delay the recovery of the industry. I mean, our assumption today is that we have essentially a sort of 3-month lockdown during the third quarter, and then travel restrictions are relaxed, and we start to see a recovery from that point. But I think in the third quarter it will still be weak because of the recession. The economic forecast suggests that the fourth quarter we'll see some strong economic stimulus from the fiscal packages and what the central banks are doing, and we would hope to see, and in fact we've built into our forecasts at the moment, a significant increase. But if you recall the earlier chart, we don't see the industry back to pre-crisis levels by the fourth quarter, so it won't be until 2021 that we would expect a significant recovery.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. We have a question about financial relief to airlines, and the question is, can government help come from the potential to take shares in airlines?
of course it can. We have seen already announcements from government, that they were of capital injection, or even going up to nationalizing their airline. So yes, it can. And if you need, equity, and equity coming from the government, says as a financial relief for some airlines, it will probably happen more and more often.
Okay. We have a question about crew, and hearing growing concerns from crew members who are still flying that not enough is being done to protect their health and safety when they fly. Can you talk about what steps carriers are taking to ensure that their crew members do not get affected by the novel coronavirus?
First of all, we have a figure that is interesting. The number of contamination cases in both in aircraft is very, very low. It's something, I speak under your control, Tony, that a handful over 500,000 flights or something like that. So it's very, very low. That's the first point. But it has happened. We have seen some cases. So every airline is taking measures, to protect its crew by cleaning and disinfecting the aircraft, by giving them equipment. I suppose that some of them are testing their crew regularly, and then many of them, they have also a health insurance program to cover potential cure or hospital care. But that's normal business for airlines, to give the equipment, the training, and to take the measures appropriate to protect their crew.
Yeah, and that's correct, Alexandre. We're in fact trying to collect data from our airlines and to help provide that to the public health authorities. And so far, I think we found a handful of cases, as in sort of an order of magnitude of like 3, where we've seen the virus passed on board the aircraft. So we see the risk as very, very low, but it's something that the airlines are taking extremely seriously with the measures that Alexandre outlined. Another question, this referring to the 35 billion liability for unflown tickets. Do we have a regional breakdown of that, particularly for Europe?
No, we don't have precise regional breakdown. What we estimate is that 10 billion over the 35 billion are from Europe. That's an estimate.
Yeah. Okay. Another question in that light: if airlines don't refund unused tickets, why should travel agents make their payments to the BSP?
The point is not. I'm sorry to tell you, it's not exactly that. There is no symmetry. What we try is everybody in the value chain is trying to preserve cash. Everybody is running out of cash because nobody has any revenues and everybody has costs. So to preserve the cash and to avoid airline being completely bankrupt and disappear, which would not be a good news for everybody and particularly for passengers, we have proposed vouchers instead of refunding in cash. First of all, and secondly, for the little part of revenues that we see, because there are still some flights, moving in the sky, we ask the payment to be normally made from passengers through agents to airlines. But we also take into account, the situation of agents. It's a case-by-case analysis. our teams are working 24/7 to try to adapt to everybody's situation, and we know that everybody is suffering. So, but we think that maintaining the system alive and working properly, and finding the right compromise between totally antagonist and contradictory interests is of the interest of everybody. So it's what we try to do at every minute these days, under an extreme tension, because everybody is eager to have cash and is running out of cash. So that's what we try to do.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. Next question talks about the lifting of travel restrictions. We've seen China control the infection first, and now instead of that leading to an opening of travel to and from China, we've actually seen that moving in the opposite direction, with China severely limiting international capacity for the foreseeable future. How do you see that development, Alexandre, and what context would you put around it?
It's a very good question, because in the plan we are trying to put together to see how we will restart the operations and be back to normal after the health crisis is over. The coordination between states to lift the barriers they have put to travel, or the ban they have put to travel, or the restrictions they have put to travel, is a key issue, that we will have to work out with the states, with governments, or group of states, to see how we organize this lift of travel restrictions. And it's a big issue, and we are working on that to see how we'll coordinate that and organize that, because it has to be organized, otherwise it will be impossible to predict and to work out by the airlines. If it's a case-by-case, bilateral restriction lift, it will be difficult to implement. So we try to find a coordinated solution.
Okay. All right. We have a couple of questions about an announcement made today in Dubai, which I understand is the government making a capital injection into Emirates. Are you expecting to see more of the same globally?
I think Tony, that I've answered the question before about potential capital injection from governments against shares. It will be probably the case if it's the right method to inject cash.
Right, and I guess the question was anything specific on the situation in the UAE with respect to the Dubai government's announcement.
No, the interesting point was the announcement in which Dubai recognized the importance of their carriers for the well-being and the economy of the Emirates. That's a key issue, and that's what we think every government should have as an approach. It's a key asset for any country to have a strong airline industry, and therefore to help it.
Okay. We have a question about cargo, and essentially asking if the current boom in cargo will contribute to the airline's financial health.
It is clear that it's a positive. That it's one of the few positive views we have in our disastrous landscape. That's for sure. So it will contribute, but as you know, for full service airline, usually cargo represent something like less than or something around 10% of the revenues.
Yeah,
so
Brian?
it's a contribution, but which is usually not large. I don't speak about cargo operators, of course.
Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, only to agree with Alexandre. It's unfortunately a relatively small proportion of the airlines business, around about 10%. And while over the last few months, cargo has played a really important role, both in terms of taking medical supplies around and also keeping supply chains alive as well. I fear that when as the recession hits and consumers and companies stop spending, cargo is going to be suffering as well during the second quarter.
Okay. We have a question looking forward. Do you have any scenarios at this stage as to how long it would take to find a new normal for the industry? And I suppose in conjunction with that, any vision as to what that new normal might be?
Shall I take that, Alexandre? Perhaps you could add. Perhaps you could add some points on the what the new normal industry might look like. But in terms of scenarios, I mean, our current scenario is that we see a 3-month lockdown and then progressive relaxation of travel restrictions, and then the fiscal stimulus and the government rescue packages producing a stronger growth in the fourth quarter, and then a strong 2021. It's really not clear that is actually going to happen. It could be that it takes much longer for us to get through the issues with the virus. It could be that the virus comes back. So we are exploring scenarios where we have a much longer period of weakness, and obviously the numbers, the pressures on airlines are correspondingly larger. But we do, one of the other things is that we are focusing very much on restarting the industry, and we are thinking about the sort of shape that industry would be in once this crisis is past.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions concerning the situation in the UK. The first is, what is our take on the UK government in their decision not to support or do you believe that the UK government is taking enough, action to support the industry? And a follow-up to that is, would it be complicated for transnational groups like IAG if different governments take different measures?
The decision we respect the decision of the UK government. It's their decision, to see whether or not they want to help their industry, and I hope that the decision has been taken, in consideration of the situation of their respective airlines that are pretty strong and dynamic. So nothing to add about that. The second part of the question was, Tony, on the...
So when you have transnational groups like IAG, how do they fare when one part of the group might be supported by one set of measures and another part by a different set of measures?
But the point is, the only point is to know whether these measures are antagonistic or not. If they are not, they are not. If they are compatible, but the two sets of measures will be implemented. You can imagine that the government refuses to help a part of the group, and that another government accepts to help the other part of the group, and so on. It will work, huh?
Yeah. Then we have a question about trade tensions. Do we expect a reduction in trade disputes in the industry now that everyone is in the same boat and asking for aid? Or, on the contrary, could we see more tensions as airlines struggle to survive?
Brian, you want to answer that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
for me.
before I mean, the industry has been, certainly the cargo sector has been suffering before the crisis with the trade war between the US and China, and the agreement that was struck just before the virus hit was a very encouraging move. We're an industry which depends on open borders, and also, in our role in moving goods around and sustaining global supply chains. We certainly help the global economy. So this is a critical issue. I think the risk in these crisis years is that in these crisis months is that governments will, as they've done with travel restrictions, keep those borders closed. And I think it is critical that in a recovery period, we see a coordinated opening up of borders, not just for the airline industry, but for the economic activity and the global world that is sustained by it.
Thanks, Brian. I think the question was more in the context of the dispute amongst airlines, particularly Middle East and European or North American carriers, and whether we see the fact that we have this general request for relief measures could see a change in the dynamic of that discussion.
It could well do, yes. I think every airline is in the same. Not every airline is in the same boat, because there obviously there are differences. But even solvent airlines with good business models and strong balance sheets are in trouble in this sort of environment. So it is a leveler, so hopefully there will be a more peaceful environment once we're out of this.
Okay, thank you. A question about job losses. Do we have any estimate as to how many people in the industry could lose their jobs?
We don't.
Not at this stage. Brian, I've seen no figures, so it's difficult to make an estimate now.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are 2.7 million people employed by the airlines, and the industry supports 65 million jobs. So every one of those airline jobs supports 24 jobs in the wider economy. So it is critical for employment generally. But it's actually quite hard to get data on that at the moment. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of furloughs and temporary layoffs. As well as being an important employer, typically the jobs in the air transport industry are very productive in terms of generating GDP. So it's something that we would want to see, resurrected and supported during the recovery period.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. We have a question about the Chinese market. Do we have any idea as to how that's faring right now? Load factors per plane, number of flights, passengers, etc.
Yes, we have a day-to-day situation about the Chinese market. The load factors are around 60%. The number of cancellation is around 55-60% of a cancelled flight. Is around 55, 50, 60, 60%. So, and the situation is recovering very slowly. For the moment, it's more or less flattish. You have the same, Brian. We have the same figures. So, if you want to make complementary comments.
That's right. I mean, someone observed earlier that that internationally we seem to be going backwards because of the imported cases and the closures in Asia Pacific. But the Chinese domestic market, I think we are seeing some encouraging signs. The fleet was down 80-90% in January, February. It's back up significantly now. And as Alexandre said, load factors are at 60%, so passengers are returning too as China slowly goes back to work.
Okay, thank you, Brian. A question about the European situation. Do we think that Europe is moving slowly from a political point of view in helping the airlines when we consider that the US has already approved a rescue package?
The point is that the rescue packages are mainly in Europe. They are mainly the responsibility of governments, the financial and budgetary. It's much more a responsibility of governments. What is under the responsibility of the EU is mainly the regulatory side. So the slots or the passenger rights or these type of issues. In Europe, we have seen governments, acting quickly, and some haven't done anything, or even have announced that they will do anything, that they will do nothing. Sorry. So in terms of speed, for the regulatory issues, EU has done the job. We are still in negotiation for some issues to soften some elements of the regulation to help the airline. And some governments have been fast, some others less. In the Nordics, it has been spectacular. They have been very, very fast. And some big countries have announced a lot of measures. Now the point is not the announcement, is the implementation. The industry needs the money to flow in the P&L, in the balance sheet. Otherwise the situation will not be solved. Brian, you want to add something?
No, I agree with what you said, Alexander.
Okay. We have a question about basically government bailouts and saying, besides the jobs, GDP, the role that airlines are playing in globalization, economic development, and human happiness, what other macro perspective reasons can you give for governments bailing out the airline industry?
Brian, you want to
if the question in terms of macro aspects in terms of helping the wider economy, if that's the case, then I think it's essentially because of what airlines do for business. Many countries, obviously, tourism is critical, but for Europe and for the advanced countries, it's really the role that the industry plays in sustaining supply chains. And we saw in the volcanic ash cloud all the car factories that had to close down, and the lack of fresh vegetables and the like. Obviously, we've got a global close down now, but in terms of the macro benefit, aviation is actually a really important element of the recovery because of the trade and investment that it carries.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about business models. To what extent will business models change for commercial airlines as a result of this crisis? And how will the crisis affect or impact manufacturers, particularly are they asking or are they recommending anything of the airlines to help augment a quicker comeback?
Let me just tackle the business models. I mean, I think that the crisis has not been caused by any failure of airline business models. It was obviously the COVID-19. I think, though, that the result of the COVID-19 and the government responses is going to lead to some changes, because I think it's going to be, there undoubtedly will be a number of airlines that fail. They're likely to be some of the smaller, medium-sized airlines. I think we will see some consolidation. So that I think you'll see perhaps some of the more cooperative business models, some of the joint ventures that we see on international markets growing, because they are sort of more successful at both offering choice for consumers, but also being more robust in the face of shocks. I wasn't clear about the question on the manufacturers.
So I guess I understand the question as it will have an impact on manufacturers, because I think that they will see some probably delays in the deliveries, of course, delays or some cancellations in the order book. So you will have this type of consequence. And we are also asking manufacturers and the OEM, to help the industry to recover, for instance, by avoiding, increasing their prices or asking for prepayment to save cash. So that's the best way, from our point of view. They could help the airline industry in this difficult situation.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. So a question saying some governments are allowing airlines to wait with paying funds for up to a year. In that time, what happens if an airline goes bankrupt? Should there be a way for passengers to still get their money via collective fund by airlines or IATA?
No, if the airline is bankrupt, as the situation in which everybody could be facing if he has bought a ticket from an airline with bankrupt. It's not sure that it will be as the other creditors. Probably it will be difficult, to reimburse the passenger in this case, as the other creditors.
Yeah, and I think the point of issuing vouchers is to try and ensure that situation doesn't come about.
For sure, but the voucher is the best solution. The airline industry has found, to maintain, the ability of the project of traveling and flying for passengers without asking the airline, to spend cash in a situation in which they are totally out of cash. And so the one of the measures we have taken to preserve, the industry and to avoid this industry to be totally bankrupt. We know that it's difficult, but it is something that we try to put together in the better interest of the airline and the passenger.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, another question concerning vouchers. And the question is, would it be fairer to pay the refunds later and assume that as debt for the airline?
But I suppose that the question is to know whether, the vouchers could be at the end of a period to be determined, could be refunded. So leaving the choice over a period of, 1 year, 1 year and a half, or what, for the passenger either to fly, to use it, to fly, or to wait for a potential refunding. As you can imagine, this solution in terms of cash shortage, it's a much better solution for the airline because the crisis is now, the cash crisis is now in the coming 3 to 6 months. So if the refunding happens after the crisis will have finished, the impact on the airline cash will be much less negative and painful, and so they will be able to cope with that. So it could be a solution that we could figure out. But it will be something that will have to be negotiated, case by case and country by country.
Okay. We have a question about, I guess, the financial health of the industry. It's should governments at a later stage demand stronger financial reserves by airlines, seeing as this time most won't survive a lockdown of 2 months?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I've understood the question. What is the question?
So I guess in the same way as when we went through the global financial crisis, there was a demand that banks should have stronger financial reserves. I think the question here is saying, should governments be requiring airlines to hold more than 2 months cash in future?
I don't know if there is any business in which there are cash requirements from government. That would be very, very strange. Perhaps it will be a conclusion that the airline business and each airline will grow from the crisis, that they should have a stronger balance sheet. I think we should do that, probably. But to see that imposed by governments would be a bit weird. But I don't know what is your opinion, Brian, on that.
I think it's slightly different because with the banking system, there was a systemic problem that the whole credit system could collapse, and so I think there's a reason there for regulation on capital requirements. But I think a competitive airline industry is a bit different. But as Alexandre says, I think one result of this crisis is that airlines will strengthen their balance sheets. We have seen the group of leading airlines do that. But there's a long way to go for the rest of the industry, and I think yes, a result of this crisis might be stronger balance sheets.
And for the banking industry, you have guarantees on the deposit, on the individual deposit. That is a legal obligation since the economic crisis of the 30s, if you remember. So it's pretty different. The situations are not comparable between the banks and the airlines, as you said, Brian.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have one last question, and then we're really at the end of the time that we have for this. The question is, what do you see the impact of this crisis being on the manufacturers? And does IATA see airline consolidation in the way that banks consolidated after the global financial crisis?
In terms of consolidation, if we see some bankruptcy in the airline industry, there will be there will be as a consequence consolidation likely to happen. And for the manufacturers, it's never a very good news when their main customers in such a bad shape. So we'll see probably, as I told you, delays in delivery and probably some reshuffling of the order books.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre. With that, we will close off this press conference. For those, I know there were some extra questions in the queue. If you do have questions that you want answered, please send by email to corpcoms@iata.org. That's again, corpcoms@iata.org.